Well folks, it's that time of the year again, the month where spooky boy memes dominate the internet and skeletons everywhere rejoice. It's also the time of year where it's most appropriate to play horror games. I have a confession though, I've never actually completed a horror game. Well, unless you count Bloodborne. Either way, I thought it would be a good opportunity to play a few just to get in the Halloween mood, starting with one of the only horror games I own, Doom 3. Doom 3 is a terrifying sci-fi horror game experience. It is not recommended for the cowardly or the faint of heart. However, for those who dare to face Doom 3 as it was intended, lock your door, turn off the lights, and turn up the sound. What a bunch of bullcrap. Doom 3 actually sparked a spot of controversy when it first came out. id Software had taken the quintessential FPS game that had fathered the genre as a whole and had made it into something almost unrecognizable. The game went from high-octane action to slow-paced audio log listening. The shift in tone and gameplay left most old-school fans completely alienated. Now, let me tell you my experience with this game. When I was just a wee lad, I found it on my dad's big shelf of PC games. I, being a big boy, decided to give it a go, and ended up traumatizing myself, what with all its spooky monsters jumping out of closets. I could barely get past its opening section before shutting it off and never touching it since. Believe it or not, actually psyching myself up to play this game after all these years is kind of a challenge. The game starts out pretty much like every other sci-fi horror thing ever. You're a Marine sent to Mars City to do something. I don't know. The point is, it's your first day on the job and something goes terribly wrong. All of your coworkers are turned into zombies within seconds and the facility appears to be in the process of an invasion from hell. Somehow, you and your commanding officer, as well as a few other scattered survivors, aren't turned into zombies, and so now your job was to rendezvous with your commander and figure out just what's going on. The story is fairly simple and understated, but it works well enough. Its main job is to add to the atmosphere and give you an excuse to walk through more dimly lit hallways. Speaking of dimly lit hallways, I hope you like them because that's pretty much the only thing you'll see in this game. Well, seeing isn't exactly the norm. By that I mean the game is really dark. Apparently, this game's lighting engine was a pretty big deal back in the day, and so id Software was sure to make the most of it. Sadly though, this doesn't help the fact that all the characters look like they've been in some terrible face-melting accident. The darkness forces you to use a flashlight, which you can't use while you're holding a weapon, which means you'll be constantly switching back and forth between it and your weapons throughout the entire game, as even a relatively well-lit room is still really friggin' dark. This is good. It complements the survival horror aspect of the game and makes it much more stressful when a monster jumps out at you to not immediately be able to shoot at it, but have to switch to a weapon first. It also means that, at times, you won't know exactly what you're shooting at or where it is. The horror aspects of this game, however, are really pretty shallow. Doom 3's idea of scary is having monsters jump out of closets for 12 hours almost non-stop. It's seriously ridiculous how many times this game ambushes you, but can you really call it an ambush when you totally expected it because it's the exact same thing that's happened every 5 minutes since you started the game? Probably not. Part of the game really wants to be a classic shooter like the original Doom, while its other part wants to be a survival horror game. Classic shooters are fast, fluid, giving the player as much control as they possibly can to make them feel awesome. Survival horror games are on the complete opposite side of the spectrum. Their goal is to make the player feel weak, alone, and scared, the opposite of a power fantasy. They also usually restrict the control of the player to add pressure. Needless to say, these two genres don't usually mix well, and in this case, they don't. Classic shooters are based around circle strafing, dodging projectiles, and carefully managing your health and ammo. Doom 3, being based in mostly hallways and small rooms, has very little room for you to circle around your enemies. Most of the enemies don't shoot dodgeable projectiles at you, and a whole lot of damage is unavoidable. This is a shame because in the rare instances where you are placed in a large combat arena to fight enemies, it's actually really fun. This game seems like it would have been a very enjoyable sequel to the original Doom series if they had simply dropped the pretense of being a horror game and made it purely a fast-paced shooter. Doom 3 has a lot of logical fallacies in its level design, mostly by way of monster compartments. Monsters will jump out of places that simply have no business existing for whatever fictitious reason you could possibly dream up, and it just ends up feeling like a cheap haunted house. The thing is, these things have always been in Doom, but making Doom 3 as immersive as possible only makes its unimmersive qualities stand out more. In conclusion, Doom 3 tries to be both a horror game and a shooter, but ends up accomplishing neither of these things. Kind of a bummer. Don't worry though, our Halloween spooktacular has just begun. Dead Space is also a sci-fi shooter set in great corridors with lots of jump scares. It was made by Visceral Games, rest in peace, in 2008. Being released 4 years after Doom 3 gave Dead Space the power of hindsight. It could look back at all the mistakes Doom 3 made and laugh, carefully avoiding all the pitfalls it fell into. For one thing, it wasn't a sequel. It was a brand spanking new IP full of original ideas and no one to disappoint. For a game that's almost 10 years old, it looks pretty dang good, especially the animations. And you can actually see in this game. Most rooms are pretty well lit, which adds contrast to the rooms that are dark, thereby making them scarier. The controls are slow, clunky, and cumbersome. This is perfect. The close-up camera angle makes you feel claustrophobic. This, combined with the slow aim speed, makes sure that every enemy encounter is stressful. Dead Space's enemies are unique in that you have to cut off their limbs in order to kill them, which is hard considering how much they flay around and charge right at you. Everything about how this game plays serves to add pressure to the player, and the soundtrack is the icing on the cake, full of stringy, pulse-pounding horror. It's perfect for this kind of game, and always keeps you on your toes when you're exploring. Dead Space has lots of weapons, but you can only carry 4 at once. They're designed in such a way to have certain strengths and weaknesses. Having a strategy of how you're going to use them and in what order is always helpful. Your limited inventory space is just another thing that puts stress on the player, forcing them to make difficult decisions on what items they should throw out or keep. Gosh, there's just so much to love about this game. The story is actually interesting and involving, there are equipment upgrades galore, the gameplay is varied enough to never get boring, each enemy has to be dealt with differently, the jump scares aren't intrusive and give you some breathing room between them, slowly building up to them. Although fear is a naturally negative emotion, this game somehow makes it fun to be scared, unlike Doom 3 where it just gets annoying. So, in conclusion, Dead Space is a game that focuses on one thing and one thing only, survival horror. Every mechanic contributes solely to its main purpose in a refreshing sci-fi horror experience. Doom 3, on the other hand, has its moments of brilliance but ultimately fails because of its attempt to juggle 2 fundamentally different design philosophies at once. My name is JaBoc, and may we meet again. Oh, and happy Halloween.
You'll shake and shudder in surprise when you hear these zombies shriek. We're so sorry, skeletons, you're so misunderstood. You only